You're agreeing that the argument is valid. You disagree with the first premise. But if one grants that evil is that which ought not to be, then you agree the conclusion would follow. So for those of us who do think that evil is that which ought not to be, that it is a departure from the way things ought to be, you would then say that one ought to conclude to a designer.
Well, what ought to be is only our own opinion.
No, but I mean,
if society create and we
it,
decide what ought to be, and I'd like to get down to cases. That's why I asked you about divorce. Now let's consider lies or killing. The Ten Commandments says, "Thou shalt not kill." And so that means that it ought to be there is no killing. But some of us think killing in war is fine. Some of us, that there's justifications for doing it. Some of us think that killing in self-defense is correct. And people argue, is this case justified or is that case justified? So there isn't any kind of absolute standard where you can say, well, just never do this. There's no ought, but I think it's always ought to be a certain way.
Any other follow-up before we go to another question?
Well, I think that you're making a mistake in ethical theory there. You are extrapolating the absence of a norm because you are saying there are some exceptional situations that come into situations. When a situation itself presents two evil choices, do you therefore say that you can at any time lie and at any time kill? Is that what you're extrapolating?
Oh, no, I think Bill Clinton did a bad thing. I voted for him, but I think he did.
If I could
and
say,
you know what, Dr. Ligon, I agree with you. Go ahead.
It seems to me that this argument, though, that Douglas Guyvat has offered, does speak directly to Dr. Mohanty's question again, too, concerning moral realism, namely that if we think of evil as a departure from the way things ought to be, then that again implies a design plan of the way the universe ought to be. It ought to be a certain way morally, and it's not. And that implies a designer who created this design plan for the moral universe. So this would be another reason, I think, that makes theism a better metaphysical ground for the moral values we both want to affirm.
Well, I still object to the second part of the argument, and the whole idea of design is extremely misleading, because you have in your mind the picture of an architect who draws up a plan. The important thing is the first part of the argument, namely that evil is what goes against what ought to be. That means the distinction between what ought to be and what ought not to be has an objective validity.
Right.
And more than that, our moral experience does not entitle us to say, unless you have a metaphysical propensity to go beyond it and posit a source of all these things. I don't feel that propensity. I am satisfied with the objectivity of the ought and the ought not. Even if the whole world, people lie, everyone lies, still the liar is still under the moral obligation that he ought not to lie. The simple fact that most people lie does not make lie immune from the objective power of the value. That means the power of the ought. That's what my moral experience certifies.
But you see, I appreciate that, Dr. Mohanty, and that's, as you well know, even in your writings, you even have disagreed with some noted Hindu scholars on this very issue. Your article on Raja Ram Mohan Roy, you took issue with him on this very matter, because he wanted to posit a theistic first cause as a common ground. But maybe they are being more realistic with the inexorable tug to move towards the personal moral being. The very example of why your position cannot be defended objectively is sitting two chairs next to you. Why not his view? Why your view? No, so let me complete it here. So my point is that even Shankara, who was so strongly monistic, found it inescapable to begin his opening line in the commentary by saying the reason he was writing this commentary was to find a way to do away with evil. And in that very critical verse in the Upanishads, where Brahman refers to himself in the first person as wanting to bring creation into being, you know what Shankara did with that? He sort of danced around it and talked about it as an attributeless Brahman talking here to keep his monistic strand alive. But how do you talk about an attributeless Brahman who expresses intention, who expresses a creative desire and a multiplication of entities? So I think your conclusions may be very good that there is a moral objective order. I just don't see how there is a rational way to make it morally obligatory for anyone else.
Well, this is you see, because we have this picture that something can be morally obligatory to everyone if we have a common lawgiver who is imposing it on us. I don't know. The bindingness of the moral values comes from the moral experience itself, not from anyone else. Anyone who has felt the moral obligation to help a person who is in need, who has felt the moral repulsion of not keeping one's promise after having made it, is enough evidence for the objectivity of moral values. My problem with the physicist's point of view is not that what he's saying is not scientifically correct. I think it is wrong science to import theology into science. But I am not a scientific realist as I'm a moral realist. I regard scientific theory as a theory which is constructed by the scientific community, and that theory is taken to be true which the community accepts at the moment by its own internal canons.
Let's move on. If we can, take a question over here for Dr. Likand.
Yes,
question over here.
My question concerns your issue of evolutionary on the African savanna. I'm a biologist by training, molecular and genetic. I'm curious, you say that a group of people or many group of people came across their moral objectivism or their moral relativism through accidental means. The 50 people or 100 people got together as a band, a familial blood band, and then found laws that worked for them. What, by any evolutionary means, prevents a group of people who haven't discovered those laws coming from wiping those people out? Why were we descended from the ones who found moral truth?
Well, I wouldn't have said accidental as the source of these ancient people's moral values. They arose from even earlier times, so I wouldn't have used the word accidental. And there was nothing to prevent one group of hunter-gatherers from wiping out another group, and it happened all the time. And the societies that happen to exist today are the ones, by definition, that somehow survived, either because they were smarter or they could run faster, or we think that Neanderthals disappeared because somehow our ancestors had certain advantages over them, and they're gone.
A question from the internet right here.
This question is for Dr. Likand from the University of Kentucky. If morals were developed independently by hunter-gatherer tribes, doesn't the fact that so many morals are the same or similar imply moral objectivity?
No, it implies that humans have common needs and common ways of living. So this is what in evolution would be called evolutionary convergence. Just as dolphins and fish have similar shapes, and birds and bats have similar shapes even though they came from very different places. A society that thought that murdering each other was a fine thing to do would be unlikely to survive. So our moral values come from those things that enabled our ancestors to survive and get their genes into the next generation.
Okay, next question is for the entire panel.
Yes. This is for the whole panel. I'm curious, first of all, for those who hold the evolutionary biology ethic, if you're biological determinists, and if you are, how do you reconcile the words that you used tonight, such as freedom and choose? Dr. Likand, in fact, I heard you say 3 times already that humans have choice and that we were making these choices. I'd like to know specifically if you're a biological determinist and how you can account for that, and also Dr. Mohanty, you as well.
Some parts of us are biologically determined. I have 5 digits on my hand, absolutely determined by the genes that I have. However, we as humans also have a great deal of freedom, and compared to other animals, seem less ruled by instinct. So to the extent that we have this freedom of behavior, our behavior is not determined. We can decide to run or fight. We can decide how we wish to behave. So we aren't compelled by our genes.
Dr. Mohanty?